New York City promises opportunity. It promises reinvention. It promises that if you work hard enough, you will be seen. But for many people, the city delivers something else entirely. Disappointment, isolation, and a kind of failure that never makes the headlines. This story isn't about a crime scene. There are no sirens, no arrests, and no bodies. It's about a couple who moved through New York quietly, professionally, leaving behind a trail of people who felt used, discarded, and completely erased. By the time anyone understood what had happened, there was nothing left to confront. There was only the damage. They were not criminals, at least not in any way you'd recognize. Malik Johnson worked in corporate risk and compliance. His entire job was to identify weaknesses, not in systems, but in people. His partner, Ava Brooks, was a licensed therapist associate. She was trained to listen, trained to gain trust, trained to hold people's most fragile, secret truths. Together, they lived in a quiet, expensive apartment in Manhattan. They paid their taxes. They went to community events. They spoke the language of empathy and professionalism fluently. People felt safe around them, and that was always the first mistake. In a city like New York, people talk too much. Not because they're gossips, but because they're tired, exhausted. They talk about their immigration worries, their crushing debt, the constant fear of being replaced at work. They talk about their mental health struggles, the one mistake they can't afford to make again. And Ava listened. She listened without judgment. Malik, on the other hand, remembered everything. Every detail, every insecurity. They never asked for anything in return, not directly anyway. The cost would come later, when you least expected it. The first person to truly unravel was a junior architect named Daniel. He was ambitious, talented, but stretched thin. After months of confiding in Ava, sharing his professional anxieties and personal dreams, Daniel suddenly lost a major contract. Then another one. Then, out of the blue, his landlord refused to renew his lease. There was never an explanation. No accusation, just a series of silently closing doors. Daniel blamed himself. He thought he'd messed up, that he wasn't good enough. And that's what made their method so effective. Most victims blamed themselves. They became the authors of their own destruction. So how did people really disappear in their orbit? No one was ever threatened. There was no blackmail, no confrontation. Instead, it was subtle. It was quiet. Emails would just stop arriving. Professional references that were once glowing would suddenly go cold. Vague rumors would appear out of nowhere with no clear source. Quiet concerns would be raised in just the right ear at just the right time. People began to doubt their own reality. Was it just bad luck? Was the market just that tough? Was this just New York being New York? This city is very, very good at convincing you that your suffering is normal, that it's just part of the deal. The few people who were invited into their home all described the same strange feeling. It wasn't fear, it was emptiness. The apartment had no photos on the walls, no keepsakes, no memories, nothing that signaled a life being lived. It felt sterile, temporary. One guest later said it felt like a place where people came to confess, not to live. Another person who visited remembered leaving with a distinct sensation. He said, "I don't know how to explain it, but I left feeling smaller than when I arrived." The apartment wasn't a home. It was a stage, a place designed to make others feel vulnerable, while its owners remained completely hidden. Years passed before anyone started to connect the dots. The victims were scattered across different industries, different social circles. They were all just isolated incidents of bad luck. But those who suffered shared one thing in common. They had all trusted Ava. They had all spoken freely to her. They had all believed they were in a safe, confidential space. New York is full of predators. We all know that. But the most effective ones don't chase you down the street. They don't have to. They just wait, they listen, and they let your own words become the weapon used against you. One woman, a nonprofit consultant, finally began to notice. She was meticulous, a natural note-taker. At first, she blamed herself for her own string of professional misfortunes. But then she started to look back at her calendar. Dates, introductions, outcomes. She mapped out her social network and saw Malik and Ava at the center of several connections that had gone sour. She didn't have proof, nothing she could point to. But she noticed something devastating. Every loss felt intensely personal to the victim, but the pattern was completely impersonal. It was mechanical, it was ruthlessly efficient. The true horror of this story wasn't just what the couple did. It was the aftermath. It was the emotional cost. People didn't feel angry, not at first. They felt ashamed. They felt foolish for trusting so easily. They felt used and, most of all, just profoundly tired. The experience had hollowed them out. Several of them left New York entirely, their dreams shattered. One former victim summed it up perfectly. He said, "I came here to build a life. I left feeling like I had been quietly deleted." You don't just lose a job or an apartment. You lose your belief in yourself. So why did nothing happen? Why weren't they stopped? Because no laws were broken, no threats were recorded, no violence was ever reported. How do you prove that a quiet conversation led to your career's collapse 6 months later? The proof was all circumstantial, all emotional. It wasn't strong enough to stand up in a court of law. The system, our entire legal and social framework, simply had no language for what happened. It was a kind of violence so subtle, so psychological, that it was invisible to the very institutions meant to protect us. And so the system did nothing. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no satisfying conclusion. Malik quietly resigned from his job. Ava let her therapy license lapse and stopped practicing. Their empty, sterile apartment was sold. They just vanished. No statements were made. No apologies were ever offered. The city, in its relentless, forward-moving way, just absorbed the story the way it absorbs everything else. Quickly, without reflection. The people they harmed were just another bit of debris washed away by the current. The most dangerous people in a city like New York are not the ones who scream and rage. They're the ones who listen, the ones who understand the rules of the game better than anyone else. They are the ones who know that disappointment is a much more powerful weapon than fear, because fear makes people fight back. It makes them loud. But disappointment just makes them disappear. And in a city this big, this loud, and this distracted, almost no one notices when you do. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the unseen corners of our world.